It is 1147. In response to the growing threat in the east, armies from all over Europe assembled to march into the Holy Land. The successful Crusaders established several new states in the eastern regions following the First Crusade and a short follow-up campaign in 1101. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa were three of these early strongholds. The most at risk was Edessa. It was a small, sparsely populated area located far to the north, frequently eclipsed by its larger neighbors. Because of its remote location, it was a prime target for attacks by neighboring Muslim nations such as the powerful Seljuk Turks. The Edessa struggle. The Count of Edessa at the time, Baldwin II, made every effort to protect this delicate region. But the Battle of Harran in 1104 dealt a devastating blow. In the confusion of defeat, Baldwin II and his ally, Jocelyn of Courtenay, who would go on to become Count, were taken prisoner. Edessa was further weakened by the loss, leaving it vulnerable to the vultures of ever-increasing threats. The luck for Baldwin and Jocelyn didn't end there. Both were taken by the enemy again after their initial capture in 1122. After the Crusader victory at the Battle of Ars in 1125, Edessa regained some of its previous strength in spite of these setbacks. However, the tenuous tranquility did not last long. After Jocelyn was killed in battle in 1131, all of Edessa's issues were left to his son, Jocelyn I, who became the new Count of Edessa, the Seljuk growth. At the same time, the Seljuk Sultanate's ambitious governor, Zengi, was becoming more powerful. He took over Aleppo, which is regarded as Syria's key to power, in 1128. With Aleppo under his control, Zengi's power increased, and the danger to Edessa intensified. Knowing that danger was imminent, Jocelyn II allied himself with the local Muslim dynasty, the Artukids, and led his army out of Edessa to fight alongside them against Zengi's forces near Aleppo. However, their timing was terrible. Zengi quickly turned north and besieged the now undefended Edessa, while Jocelyn marched to support the Artukids. Edessa's decline. The city resisted Zengi's forces for a month. However, Edessa fell with weapons ready on December 24, 1144. But Zengi didn't take much time to enjoy his triumph. He was compelled to return home shortly after Edessa fell, and he turned his attention to Damascus. However, destiny stepped in. The assassination of Zengi, one of Zengi's slaves, assassinated him. Nur ad-Din, his son, inherited his father's power and would soon surpass him in strength. Edessa's collapse in 1144 Europe was shocked to learn of Edessa's collapse. On December 1st, 1145, Pope Eugene III issued the bull Quantum Predecessories, which called for a Second Crusade based on information brought by pilgrims and embassies. The Pope demands a crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux was recruited by the Pope to preach at Vézelay in 1146. Following Bernard's sermon, many nobles, including Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Louis VII of France, took their lives. Thereafter, Bernard went to Germany, where he joined King Conrad III. Armies readied themselves to march to the Holy Land as support grew throughout Europe. The army of French Crusaders. The total size of the French army was probably between 30,000 and 35,000 soldiers. Heavy armored knights, who constituted a sizable percentage of the entire force, formed the core of the French army. Several thousand infantrymen, many of whom were peasants with little military experience, are thought to have served in the French army. Additionally, there would be non-combatant soldiers, camp followers, and other logistical support, all of which were essential to Crusader armies. The army of German Crusaders. Between 40,000 and 50,000 soldiers were estimated to be in the German army, which was larger than the French force. Like the French, knights and noblemen from all over the Holy Roman Empire comprised the core of the German army, which was composed of heavily armored cavalry. The path leading to the Holy Land. To determine their course, the French Crusaders convened. Because of the animosity between Conrad III and Roger II of Sicily, The Germans decided to travel overland through Hungary because the sea route was not feasible. Ultimately, they decided to follow Conrad's plan and set out on June 15th, although many French nobles still harbored misgivings about the land route through the Byzantine Empire due to First Crusade accounts. The arrival of the Germans in Constantinople. With a specific objective in mind, the German Crusaders set out eastward to join their French counterparts in the magnificent city of Constantinople. They had imagined a solid partnership with the Byzantines, anticipating a wealth of supplies to bolster their campaign in addition to military support. However, Byzantium's Emperor Manuel, who was always cautious, reluctantly welcomed them. In 1147, the Crusader armies finally departed Constantinople and headed for the Holy Land. The march goes on. There were issues during the journey through the city, and the encounter between the Byzantines and the Crusaders signaled a growing lack of trust between them. King Conrad made a daring choice in Anatolia. He chose to target Iconium, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, rather than wait for the French. Conrad underestimated the difficult terrain and the threats that lay ahead because he was so sure of his strength. Bishop Otto of Freising, his half-brother, took the camp followers along the safer coastal road while he led his best knights and troops on an overland march. The Germans are attacked by the Seljuks, but on October 25, 1147, catastrophe struck. At the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, the Seljuks launched a vicious attack that almost destroyed Conrad's army. Turkish forces relentlessly harassed Conrad's army, forcing them to make a slow and exhausting retreat back to Constantinople. Turkish forces relentlessly harassed the German army, capturing stragglers and overpowering the rear guard. Otto's division, meanwhile, did not fare any better. In early 1148, the Seljuks also ambushed them as they marched south toward the Mediterranean coast. The destruction of the German army. This army of Crusaders was routed, the Holy Land via the French route. Under the leadership of King Louis, the French Crusaders sailed from Metz in June 1147, soon followed by troops from England and Normandy. They followed Conrad to Constantinople, where they were greeted more hospitably than the Germans by Emperor Manuel. The entire force crossed the Bosporus into Anatolia once the remaining Crusader forces arrived. The French joined the Germans. They encountered the battered remains of Conrad's army at Laodicea in Anatolia. Weakened but determined, Conrad accompanied Louis. In December, they reached Ephesus by marching together along Otto of Freising's coastal route. News of an imminent Turkish attack reached them, but Louis persisted, unfazed. The attacks by the Seljuks at the Battle of Ephesus, which took place on December 24th, the Turks launched an attack, but the French prevailed and repelled another ambush at the Battle of the Meander later that month. At the Battle of Mount Cadmus in early 1148, catastrophe struck once more. The Turks harassed Louis's troops from a distance, causing the vanguard led by Amadeus of Savoy to split up and sustain significant casualties. Progress became even more dangerous as the Turks burned the land before the French did, starving them and their horses. The French chose a route along the coast. Louis, feeling discouraged and weak, decided to forego the land route and assemble a fleet at Italia to set sail for Antioch. However, most of the promised ships never showed up after a month-long delay caused by storms. The remaining soldiers were forced to continue the exhausting march after Louis and his closest men desperately claimed the few ships that did show up. It was a death march for those who remained. Before they even made it to Antioch, the once powerful French army was all but destroyed by Turkish attacks and plagued by disease. The trip to Jerusalem storms caused delays, but Louis eventually arrived in Antioch. He and King Conrad had both undergone dreadful marches through Anatolia's hostile landscape. However, they and Otto of Freising arrived in Jerusalem, the Holy City, in April 1148. Jerusalem provides support to the Crusaders. There was a surge of hope with their arrival. The European reinforcements were warmly received by Jerusalem's nobles, and soon a great council was convened to decide the Crusaders' next course of action. The High Court of Jerusalem convened with the recently arrived Crusader leaders in the largest gathering of its kind. After much discussion, it was decided that Damascus would be their target. Damascus gets ready for an assault. Damascus was a favorite target of the Crusaders because it had recently switched allegiance to the Zengids after previously being an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The regent of Damascus, Mu'in ad-Din Unur, wasted no time in preparing for the impending battle after word of the Crusaders' approach spread swiftly. He gathered his troops and strengthened the city's defenses. The Crusader armies were moving by July. They marched toward the start of the siege of Damascus after gathering at Tiberias, where their numbers grew to an astounding 50,000. In the hope that the Ghouta region's verdant orchards would supply them with the means to maintain a protracted siege, the Crusaders chose to approach Damascus from the west. Dense fruit tree groves lined the gutter, providing some respite from the scorching July sun, but danger lurked beneath the branches as Muslim soldiers and archers stood ready to ambush the advancing Crusaders. The Crusaders arrived close to the city on July the 23rd. Marching toward the city are the Crusaders. The armies of Louis VII and Conrad III marched behind the vanguard of the Crusader army, led by the forces of Jerusalem, as they made a slow advance through the orchards. However, as they advanced, they ran into strong opposition from the forces of the Damascus defenders. The conflict for Damascus starts. They were well prepared for the attack and took advantage of the dense foliage to launch a volley of javelins and arrows from concealed positions. In the midst of this, King Conrad III led a charge to breach the Muslim defenses, and his German knights engaged in ferocious combat with the defenders in the orchards. For a short while, it appeared as though the Crusaders might be able to overcome the Muslim defenses. They advanced toward the Barada River, forcing the defenders to retreat to the city's outskirts. However, the victory was short-lived as the day went on, and the constant attacks from Damascus's professional troops, as well as the intense heat and fatigue, started to wear them down. The Crusaders were forced back into the orchards by the defenders' counterattacks, which were supported by city reinforcements. Outside the city, the Crusaders set up camp. The Crusader army had not made much progress by nightfall and was unable to reach the city walls. The Crusaders reorganized and prepared to lay siege to Damascus, setting up camps outside the western walls near the orchards. Inside the city, panic broke out as the populace feared that the walls would fail to hold, and they sent urgent appeals for assistance to their Muslim allies, including Nur ad-Din Zengi of Aleppo and Sif ad-Din Ghazi of Mosul. The camps are attacked by the Seljuks. The Crusaders were caught off guard by Unur's violent attack on their camp on the second day, which forced them to retreat into the orchards and away from the walls. The situation had gotten worse by the third day when the Crusaders were caught between the well-defended walls of Damascus and the oncoming army of Nur ad-Din Zengi. Their determination was further weakened by the news that a sizable Muslim relief force was en route. The siege is abandoned by the Crusaders. The leaders of the crusade convened a council to determine their next course of action. Tensions were high, and disputes arose between the leaders of Jerusalem, France, and Germany. On the fourth day, the Crusaders made the fateful decision to end the siege completely. Each Christian force felt deceived by the other, and this mistrust would endure for a generation as a result of the defeat. For years to come, the orchards of Ghouta, which had once been a symbol of plenty, would stand as silent witnesses to the failed aspirations of the armies that had marched from the west, only to be pushed back by Damascus's tenacity.